So this morning I want to talk about a teaching that is both, I think, uh, deceptively simple and profoundly transformative. W- if we're open to it, we find teachings everywhere. I mean, they're just always presenting themselves to us. And the one this morning comes down simply to four words, and it is, "Don't make it worse." Don't make it worse. And as some of you know, during my working life, I spent a fair amount of time in jails and state prisons and federal prisons evaluating inmates for the courts. And I heard this phrase a lot from the wisdom of incarcerated individuals. And it's an environment where this statement really has resonance. The statement, "Don't make it worse." And this is from folks whose daily challenge was simply to survive in a harsh and often cruel environment. And they developed it, and spread it around as a practical shorthand for navigating extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And I was struck again and again, I am struck again and again how the most potent Dharma often arises not from mountaintop retreats or brilliant teachers or authors, but from the crucible of real human suffering, as happens in prisons and jails. These men living in what most of us would consider terrible conditions, being often treated terribly in that environment by fellow inmates and sometimes by the guards, distilled this essential teaching, not that they necessarily saw it through the lens of the Dharma, but it goes something like this: things are bad enough, just don't make it worse. Things are bad enough. And and we recognize this teaching immediately because at the heart of it, it is the teaching of the second arrow that the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught that when we're struck by that first arrow, we have which is the unavoidable pain of life. It's loss, it's frustration, it's disappointment, it's all the unavoidable suffering that life hands us. That's the first arrow. But the second arrow that we shoot into ourselves through our reactions, our clinging, our spinning out with things, make it worse. The first arrow is unavoidable. It's just the situation as it is, but it's the second arrow that we add to it. "Don't make it worse" is an accessible translation of this ancient insight. And as a community that values, ancient Buddhist wisdom, we can really see how this fits, I think. And I want to look at what's happening in the mind when we have this tendency with the second arrow to make things worse this morning. So let me get a little wonky here for a moment. From a psychological perspective, when we encounter difficulty, the threat detection system in our brain activates. It's primarily located in a part of the brain called the amygdala. We sometimes call that the body's fire alarm. But when that gets triggered, when the threat detection system gets triggered, stress hormones flood the body, um, cortisol, and other stress hormones. And in this state of reactivity, when the threat detection system gets triggered, we're primed to act impulsively. We shoot before we think. Okay, and and so we say that sharp word. We catastrophize in our minds. We grasp for control. We numb out. We do all these counterproductive, if not harmful things, many of which are in service. If our physical survival is not in danger, many of them are in service of protecting the ego, because the ego feels in danger, the ego feels threatened. And in modern times, that's most of the kind of threat we encounter. It's not someone, gonna shoot me, run over me, hit me over the head with a limb and take my mastodon steak. It's threats to the ego. And what I love about today's teaching, "Don't make it worse," when we invoke it functions as a reminder to pause, to interrupt the reactive cycle, to not give in to the threat detection system. Don't let that run the show. Now, interrupting that reactive cycle doesn't demand that or doesn't require that we know the right thing to do in that moment. And it doesn't require that we be wise or carrying our understanding in that moment. It's not that difficult. It's simply at that moment, and we can come back to those things, the wisdom part, the problem solving part. It simply asks us in that moment to not add fuel to the fire. Don't make it worse. So psychologically, in terms of the second era, that pause is everything. You may have heard this quote. It's really one of my favorite quotes of all time from Viktor Frankl. He says, "It is in the space between the stimulus and the response where our freedom lives." And he's talking there about the freedom from suffering. And one of the things I find most liberating and freeing about this teaching is its humility, because it doesn't require that we know what to do that's better. We might not be wise and caring in that moment. That moment might be mysterious. It might be too difficult a situation. But what if we don't necessarily need to worry about that? There's the humility piece. What we just have to worry about not making it worse. The guys I used to see incarcerated, they didn't sit around thinking about the wisdom of saying don't make it worse. They were just focused on not making it worse. Don't antagonize the biggest guy in the exercise yard. If you're already feeling threatened, don't go over there and poke the tiger. So how often do we add suffering to our first arrow, our initial suffering, by believing we should know what to do? This teaching doesn't ask us to know what we should do, at least not in that moment. We can reflect on it later. How often does the pressure to fix something, to heal something, to resolve something, to improve something, how often does that pressure itself become the second arrow? I must do this. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. I have to fix it right now. No, I don't. I just need to pause and not shoot from the hip and not just fire off randomly. The beauty of this teaching, don't make it worse, gives us permission to not know the solution or have to come up with a solution in that moment. It only asks that we not make it worse. It gives us permission to simply stop. And in that stopping, in that pause, something begins to relax inside. The threat detection system starts to calm down and go offline. We simply settle ourselves. Then, as we settle ourselves, our sensitivity increases. We begin to notice more subtle and subtler ways that we've been adding to our own suffering. We notice how we've been adding reactivity to our interactions. Notice how we've been adding suffering to our experience. This is the progressive deepening of mindfulness practice of our path. Noticing and just putting that pause in there. It's not that we immediately achieve perfect peace. That's not going to happen. I mean, if only that would happen, but it's not going to happen. But it is that our baseline shifts. And from that shifted baseline, we can begin to perceive what we couldn't perceive a moment before when we're in full-blown reactive threat detection mode. And this is where the teaching connects to something that I think is essential on our path. In the earliest Buddhist teachings, when you go back and look at it, wisdom is understood as wisdom about delusion. And I'm going to clarify that in a moment. Wisdom about delusion, also known as ignorance. As you will recall, ignorance is one of the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. Ignorance is where we get caught. It's how we cling. It's how we react. It's how we make things worse because we're too busy reacting to see things clearly. And here I'm not talking about wisdom in some grand, eloquent, esoteric, philosophical way, about mystical experiences on emptiness and cosmic oneness or whatnot. No, I'm talking about something very fundamental and practical in a way that resonates more deeply, I think, and certainly appeals so strongly to me in terms of how I view these teachings. Remember, in our community, and this is not everybody's cup of tea, we emphasize practice that is grounded, that is embodied, and that is applicable to daily life. And don't make it worse is right up there with the top 10. The Buddha wasn't offering. This is the brilliance of Stephen Batchelor's work when he gets back into the early sutras. The Buddha wasn't really offering a metaphysical system. A lot of that got layered on later by subsequent teachers. He was, if you strip away a lot of that stuff, he was offering a practical way to understand and reduce suffering. It just doesn't get any clearer than that. And in reducing that suffering, he doesn't begin with transcendence. He doesn't begin with some mystical formula, but with simple, humble recognition. Oh, such as, oh, I'm doing it again. I'm adding to my suffering. How can I do this less often or less intensely? I'm doing it again. What am I doing here to make myself more miserable? Because if we understand how we cling, if we understand how we react, if we understand the concept of second arrows, then maybe we won't do them as often or as intensely. And then when we don't do them, wonderful things begin to happen and open to us. Things like peace, compassion, generosity, an open, loving heart. These aren't achievements we manufacture. We don't go to the book and say, how do I achieve peace and compassion? They are what naturally emerges when we stop obscuring them and running over them with reactivity. Reactivity just runs ripshod over those qualities. And when we stop doing it, when we stop that hair trigger, those things can kind of bubble to the surface. So let's just say for a moment that we have some sort of transcendent, extrasensory experience or whatever, some sort of oneness with the universe, and then we lose it. Then our mind starts spinning again. I lost it. I have to get it back. It's embarrassing. I hope no one notices I'm no longer, transcendent. And in that spinning, it's another form of the second arrow. We just make it worse. Here we're just clinging to a spiritual experience in the same way we might cling to money or status or ego needs or whatever. And this is important, I think, for we practitioners because our practice itself, our meditation, sitting with it, can become a source of second arrows if we turn our meditation into a graded performance. Oh, that was an A minus. Yesterday was an A plus. Oh, this is terrible. It's all of that judgment, all of that second arrow stuff that increases our suffering because we measure ourselves against these idealized, unachievable states. If I grasp at yesterday and try to cling to yesterday's insight, I feel diminished when today offers me something less than that. If I'm able to make things worse, then I also have the ability and skills not to make them worse. Think about that. If I can make them worse, which I can do with great regularity and predictability, it means I also have the ability and skills to not make them worse, to not invoke that second arrow. Making things worse actually requires effort. It requires a certain amount of creativity because I have to come up with all this baggage, all these second arrow self statements. I have to spin stories. I have to project into the future. I have to rehearse grievances. I have to relive them. I have to construct elaborate justifications for acting badly toward others. That's exhausting cognitive work. How about I don't do that? We have everything we need simply to not go there, simply to not make things worse. Just like the guys, on the yard in state prison, they understand this at a very fundamental, almost not almost at a survival level. Just don't make it worse. And this is not about acquiring something new or becoming a different person or getting a personality transplant. It's about recognizing the intelligence and awareness that we already possess, and as the Buddha instructed us, to redirect it. Simply ceasing to direct it towards suffering. So let me offer you a practice to take away from today. And this week, when you notice a difficulty arising, and this is for me as well as you, so let's say in a traffic jam, in a conversation, in your own mind, judging your meditation, simply ask, how am I about to make this worse? Just put yourself on notice. Just put that in front of you, which we don't do enough. How am I about to make this worse? If the answer is yes, just don't do it. Just simply don't do it. If you understand how you're about to make it worse, let it go. You don't need to make it better. You don't need to fix it. You don't need to understand it. You just need to not make it worse. Okay. So if I drop that my famous carafe of coffee in the kitchen and coffee's everywhere, I don't need to make it worse by piling on all kinds of judgment about how stupid and clumsy and klutzy and messy I am and what a nightmare it is to clean it up and yada 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 and the dog's gonna lick it and they're gonna get all strung out on caffeine. I mean, I don't need to go into this whole litany of second arrows. I can just clean it up and be done with it. Stuff happens. Stuff happens. Coffee carafes get dropped. Eggs get broken. But we don't have to add to that suffering, which is what we do. Don't make it worse. Okay. We notice what happens when I pause. In that pause, we notice that we relax a little bit. The threat detection system starts to go offline. The cortisol begins to sort of levels drop. We notice that settling. We notice what begins to open when we stop adding to the difficulty of being alive. Being alive can be hard enough. We do not need to help the process. This is not a small teaching. I mean, I think in its simplicity, it's incredibly profound because I think in some ways it's the very foundation of our practice. Everything else, the joy, the freedom, the compassion, the wisdom, will follow from this one recurring radical act of restraint. Don't make it worse. Put that on your mirror, put that on your refrigerator. And at the end of the day, may we all find the courage just to simply not make it worse. So there's some wisdom today from our fellow human beings that are in dire circumstances. Let us talk about it.